Hi everyone. CNA is currently hiring, and I wanted to highlight a position for AI with AI listeners. Our enterprise, systems, and data analysis team is looking to hire a senior research specialist to conduct research into artificial intelligence and machine learning systems design. To learn more or apply for this position, visit the link in our show notes.
Welcome to AI with AI. That's Artificial Intelligence with Andy Lachinsky, a podcast from CNA Talks, where we discuss the latest breakthroughs and implications in artificial intelligence and autonomy. We have an email address, ai@cna.org. If you have any questions or comments, just drop us a line, ai@cna.org. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. That's cna.org/CAAI. Well, with that, Andy, I see we have a bunch of kind of like DoD news items here. So with that, what is the latest and greatest in artificial intelligence and autonomy?
Yeah, a couple of GAO reports, the Government Accountability Office, and a couple of announcements. So let's just jump right in.
All right.
So two reports. The first one came out on March 30th. They're kind of, I guess, paired together. One deal is kind of DoD-wide, one is Navy, but both of them in their own way, they kind of look at what DoD-wide and the Navy side has kind of come out by way of AI strategies and plans and so on, and kind of assessed, where are they going? Did they really spell out everything that they need to spell out? And both of these reports actually raise a bunch of concerns, but they have also very specific recommendations. So starting with the DoD side first, and we'll provide all the obligatory links. They went through 9 different AI-related strategies and plans, and they assessed them in various categories of, were they clear on mission statement, were they clear on goals and objectives, resources, investments, that kind of thing. And they broke it down into, do these individual plans fully included? Did they partially included? Don't they include it at all? Well, there were a lot of shortfalls, and they're all kind of under the broad rubric of, we have all these AI-related strategies, but we don't really have full descriptions of the resources, the investments, the risks involved, and there's no real, as yet, high-level plan or roadmap that captures all the requirements and milestones. And so what the GAO report does, and kudos to them, it's easy enough to kind of go in after the fact and kind of mop up and say, all right, here are the deficiencies, and they've done that. But they've come out with rather specific recommendations of what the DoD should do. And it involves all the things that they found gaps in. So for example, the SecDef should ensure that, that we have guidance that defines the outcomes and monitors accountability for all AI-related activities. One that caught my eye, because it's an issue that I've kind of grappled with in one of my papers, is there's still a need to establish a common terminology for AI-related activities. I mean, how many years into this are we? The GAO itself kind of underscores the fact, look, we have people sitting across the table, they don't always speak the same language. Finally, finalize and issue guidance and agreements that define the roles and the responsibilities of the military services. Again, you kind of would think that it would have been done by this point, and it really hasn't. And there are a bunch of other things. So it's not a short report. It's about 100 pages. There's lots of detail in there, and there are lots of examples of where the shortfalls take place, but very good recommendations. I hope the DoD follows through.
Yeah, and should be very timely because the DoD AI strategy was from 2018. And I believe, if I'm understanding correctly, the intent is to rewrite the DoD strategy this year. Right. So they should be able to use these recommendations with that update.
So as I said, they're kind of two partnered together. They may have been published on the same day, if I'm not mistaken. So the second GA report has to do with the Navy, more specifically with the Navy's uncrewed maritime systems portfolio. So I guess the request for the new fiscal year is something like $4.3 billion on 21 different uncrewed vessels. GAO looked at that and again came up with a bunch of recommendations, but the essence of kind of what underscores all of them is that the Navy still hasn't, in the GAO's opinion, accounted fully for all the costs that are relevant for developing and operating these systems. 7 recommendations. We're not going to go into all of them, but the 3 that kind of on the top level, listen, we recommend that you complete a full estimate of the full cost of developing and operating the systems, develop a clear evaluation criteria for prototypes, and create an entity in charge to oversee the Navy's uncrewed maritime systems portfolio. Again, these are kind of obvious first steps.
Yeah.
They've maybe fallen through the cracks a little bit. There are a couple of other recommendations, not quite as long as the DoD assessment, or for the DoD. This one chimes in at about 60 pages or so. But again, a very nice look, and the Navy, I think, ought to think carefully about the recommendations made in it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the Navy's reaction, particularly to that last point, because as you may recall, when we were starting this podcast back in 2017, 2018, the Navy was just disestablishing its unmanned systems office and 99. So here we are, back to the future, I guess.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned the comments. I was actually a little surprised that there is an appendix. It's actually Appendix 3 for those of you who follow our link, where the GAO actually published the letter that the Navy sent them back, kind of addressing all the recommendations, and the Navy concurred with all of the report's recommendations. But the GAO report nonetheless says that whatever the rebuttal the Navy gave in its letter, it still does not fully address the first 3 of the recommendations made in the full GAO report. So stay tuned. Next story is a quick follow-up in a sense. Like a couple of podcasts ago, I think at the beginning of March, we talked about Project Convergence, remember? Where the Army was supposed to demo some swarms. Well, kind of as a lead-up, I guess, to that, it was announced on 22nd of April. In fact, it's taking place as something called Edge 22. It's a 2022 experimental demonstration gateway exercise. It's running from April 25th through May 12th in Utah, Dugway Proving Ground near Salt Lake City. And Edge 22, it's itself a part of a series of a whole bunch of experimentation exercises that's hosted by the Army, designed to evaluate new technologies and so on. So at this one, they are testing swarms in particular. And in fact, the swarm or swarm exercises will be among the largest of the interactive air-launched effects, AILs as they're called, that the Army has ever tested. And they're going to be put through a variety of paces, kind of, the usual detect, identify, locate, report, a bunch of stuff. So we don't have any particulars yet. This was just kind of an announcement. Some of the drones that'll be used within the swarm, one of them is called the Altius 600. I forgot which company makes it. It's written down here in our notes. Area I, aerospace company in Cobb County, Georgia. They're like 27 pounds. They have a range of almost 300 miles. And they have a bunch of tasks that they can perform. And as I say, this will be the largest of its kind that the Army has ever tested. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what they do there.
I've seen other reports that I was a little bit dubious about their use of the word swarm. So I will be more than happy to see what comes out of this particular exercise.
Yeah, talk about, we just said there's still a divergence of opinion as to what AI terminology means to different people. Swarms is even worse in many ways.
Indeed.
So we'll see. So before we get to 2 really neat research items, 2 quick announcements, COD-wise and AI-wise. So for a while now, John Sherman has been the acting Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer, the CDAO. So on the 25th of April, DoD announced that Dr. Craig Martell will in fact assume the duties as Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer. What's interesting is he's most recently served as the head of machine learning for Lyft. He was a professor at one point, I guess, at NPS. So he knows a little bit about the Navy, clearly. He's been the head of machine learning at Dropbox. He led a number of AI teams and initiatives at LinkedIn. He worked at RAND. This was way back in like the early 2000s as a computer and information scientist. So it's an interesting mix, right? You have someone, certainly not from DoD. He knows a little bit about the Navy side just from NPS. He's clearly one very well versed in AI. And I found this interesting quote that Breaking Defense, which is where we'll provide the link where I learned about the story, appeared. They quote Martell as saying, quote, "I think they, DoD, really need someone from industry who knows how to bring real AI and analytical value at scale and speed." Continuing with the quote, one of the things that industry does well in a very agile way is turn on the dime. That's something's not working. Let's try this. And that's not working. Let's try this. On the other hand, coming from industry, I'm continuing the quote, has a downside that I don't know my ways around the Pentagon yet. And I don't know what levers to pull. But it's a very interesting choice.
I was a bit surprised to see this announcement, but there's a lot of exciting potential there. And certainly, as he says, right, the sort of lessons and ideas that he's bringing from industry will be very powerful. But if I'm going to be a little bit cautious, I will agree, right, that knowing how the Pentagon works is a really critical part of any job, especially at that level. So it may take some time before we see some really big movement there, but there's some great potential there.
And on the other hand, if he does have trouble with that coupling, Margaret Palmieri, right, who founded and directed the Navy's Digital Warfare Office, she'll be the deputy CDAO. So I don't know how they're going to split duties or what she'll be doing, but clearly there's somebody already well entrenched and kind of knows how the process works. Another very quick item, and then we'll move to research. This is really not very surprising to me. Perhaps it's in the category of, again, this should have happened a while ago. There was a GeoInt symposium, geointelligence in Denver, I guess at the tail end of April. And the director of the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Vice Admiral Robert Sharp, he announced that the NGA would take over the operational control of Project Maven's GeoInt AI services. Again, it's really not surprising, right? I mean, if you think about what the NGA does, and we'll provide interesting links. I don't think we covered it explicitly on our podcast at any point, but you may want to take a glimpse as to what the NGA does by way of data for a long time, right? That's what they deal with. We'll provide links to their 2020 technology strategy and the 2021 data strategy, and it kind of outlines really the crux of what they do and why this announcement is really not a surprise, at least to me. They kind of deal with it anyway, and the NGA has been heavily involved with Project Maven since it was launched in 2017 anyway. But that's the announcement. I mean, there's nothing deeper than that, but it's another example of how things are beginning to kind of shift around, and we're seeing how the different AI stuff is being placed into different containers. And this one certainly makes sense.
Right. Project Maven had been aligned with JAIC, the Joint AI Center, I believe. So this is putting it now sort of, as you pointed out, more closely aligned with who is actually their customer in a sense. Yeah. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back.
My name's Kai Haney, and I'm a member of the team behind CNA's Inclusive National Security Event Series. As a listener of this podcast, I know that you're well aware of the benefits and challenges presented by artificial intelligence. An upcoming event will explore these issues, thinking about the implications of AI bias for national security and what can be done to prevent structural and systemic biases from being reproduced in algorithms. This virtual event will take place on June 7th at 12 p.m., and you can RSVP by clicking the link in the show notes or by emailing us at inclusivenatsec@cna.org.
Let's move on to some research. So not too long ago, we talked about dual use, right, of AI. We talked about it in a variety of ways, but in particular, it was some targeted study. In my mind, this squarely sits in there. And here's what we're talking about. There's a paper published third week in April in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The researchers themselves are from Princeton and University of Chicago. And it has to do with deep models of superficial face judgments. This is the crux of the research. They leverage existing models. In fact, they use NVIDIA's StyleGAN, or rather an improved version of it, StyleGAN 2, a generative adversarial network. I mean, there's nothing new under the hood in that sense to generate and look at the latent features that StyleGAN 2 generates for a variety of different face types. But what this study is, it's kind of more on a meta level. They use crowdsourcing to try to determine if they can model what the features are of faces that allow people to infer certain psychological traits. And you heard me correctly. So if you look older, or if you have a little bit of fatty tissue in your cheeks, then you may be either more trustworthy or more alert or whatever. And that's literally what the study is about. I found it fascinating that they underscore. I mean, they don't shy away from it at all. I mean, they clearly understand what they're doing. Our data set not only contains bias, it deliberately reflects it. I mean, this is what the whole point of the study is. So what they did, in essence, I mean, the procedure itself is very simple. It's almost tempting to truly not call this research, because there's nothing new under the hood, so to speak. It's a very focused and very easy to understand application of existing methodology. So it involves an existing tool called StyleGAN 2. It's a generative adversarial network, like I said, and crowdsourcing. They use the StyleGAN 2 to generate like 1,000 synthetic, highly naturalistic, they claim, face stimuli. And then they break it down into 34 different attributes, a specific set: trustworthy, smart, attractive, smug, whatever. And then they have the crowdsourcing part. And I find this fascinating too. There's bias on multiple levels here. There's bias that they're trying to see if they can model, right, from a latent space perspective. But there's also bias in that they only have like 30 people that they've used to do this, from whom they generate a whole bunch of, it's like 1 million different human judgments. They get like 30 unique participants per attribute, but it's only 30. They've created what they call a 1 million impressions data set, which is interesting, if not a bit scary to explore. And we'll provide a link to it where you can go in and you can see what they already include. And you can look at it for, like average rating, the variability of the rating, all 34 attributes, and you can kind of see what the system comes up with. Their goal is to actually develop a 10 million impressions data set, and they're calling for public participation. They've achieved about 11% of it. And so what they do is pretty much what I've described. There's nothing more to say other than to give kind of a few of the results and then comment on the ethics, or perhaps it's not that there's no ethics here, although strangely there's what I found kind of a dearth of a discussion, except towards at the end. I'll mention it in a few minutes. So they go through their crowdsourcing and they construct, essentially correlation matrices. Okay, we have these 34 different attributes. How does one correlate with the other? What makes sense on a broad level? Well, they found that some attribute inferences are more difficult to predict than others. Okay, what else are you going to make of that? But they found that the more data they use, the better the predictions we can make. Not terribly surprising. This is the scary part. We, and this is quoting from the paper, we broadly verified that manipulating new faces with our model actually changes people's impressions of those faces, which is part of the research here.
So just to be clear, that's like taking a face that people might rate one way, but then altering that aspect to make it more trustworthy or something like that. Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Now, some of the more interesting correlations, at least they were a little bit counterintuitive to me, they found, for example, that perceived intelligence is not strongly associated with any attribute other than being electable. Take that for what it means. On the other hand, and in contrast to that, almost every attribute, meaning that there's very little discrimination at all, almost every attribute predicts inferred political ideology. Take that what you will. That's kind of the bottom line. There are lots of examples, some of which are just interesting, some of which are frankly a little concerning. But I leave it to our readers to judge for themselves. I alluded to the fact that there's very little discussion, kind of what is the real reason for this and how does it sit in the larger landscape of dual use research? And the only thing that really comes is at the conclusion, we're quoting from the paper, the deep models of superficial face judgments that we explore in this paper can in turn be used to broaden the range of behavioral data we collect. Okay, that certainly makes sense because they define an infinite set of realistic and psychologically controlled stimuli for a new generation of behavioral experiments. So this is kind of step one of a meta level of research of where existing machine learning tools are used in this dual use way to simply explore. Step two is an easy one to imagine, anyone even looking at the title of the paper to conceive, which is, let's use the results of this and similar systems and start developing manipulation algorithms.
Yeah.
So that's the nature of dual use. I mean, there's nothing, in and of itself that's either wrong or unethical about what the research represents, but it does highlight, again, the potential for both use and profound misuse of the same underlying technology. We'll leave it to our listeners to judge.
Check out the pictures just to, there's some really neat spectrum examples where they take one image and then vary it along the spectrum from not so smart to smart, or from not so trustworthy to trustworthy. And it's interesting to see the spectrum in between as the face changes. And obviously there's other attributes like going from a skinny face to a more fat face and things like that. You can imagine the many potential uses this type of research could go down. And it's kind of where we are, but it's worth taking a look just to see kind of what they were able to do with this particular data set.
Yep. So second bit of research, as we speak, or like a couple of days ago, the 2022 version of the ICLR, the International Conference on Learning Representations, has concluded. That ran from like April 25th to April 29th. And so this is one paper that caught my eye. Researchers are from MIT, Cornell, Google, and Microsoft. And it's in the context of, and it's all about using a technique for completely unsupervised label assignments in images. So we talk about data quite a bit, right? It's not easy to label images. They give a couple of statistics where just to produce an hour of tagged and labeled data, depends on the data, of course, and the data set you're talking about, but it can take like 800 hours of human time. So however you slice it or dice it or whatever the saying is, anything that can help the preparation of data sets and label data sets a priori, right? It should be a benefit. And so these researchers, they take up the task. They develop a system called Stego, called Self-Supervised Transformer with Energy-Based Graph Optimization. What they really do, or what it consists of, is they leverage an algorithm introduced about a year ago, April 2021, essentially a visual transformer called a DINO. I forgot what it stands for, DINO. Stego leverages that And what the system essentially does is something called semantic segmentation. So imagine a picture, right? It could be anything. You're looking down a roadway, there are cars, there are buildings, traffic signs, whatever. And the idea is to segment that image into parts which have some semantic structure, at least some correlation with the basic kinds of labels that you'd expect a human to associate. So if there's a building, you'd expect there to be a building label, right? If there's a dog and so on and so forth. Well, traditionally, how it's been done, it's kind of very coarse-grained right now. We have lots of end-to-end frameworks, like in one fell swoop. Give me an image data set, and these various frameworks will, in fact, do something akin to that, but it's very coarse-grained. It'll be, sky, road, nothing that's going to, or typically that's going to distinguish on a finer grain level. So what Stego does is it leverages the dyno, and it introduces a clever kind of loss function. Let's not go into details here, but essentially looks across the kinds of things that an image contains, looks at the semantic similarity between the different parts of the image, so that, and this is where the segmentation comes in. If you're semantically similar, if it has a similar kind of use both within the same image and across a corpus of, where the whole image collection sits, that by leveraging that part, where the assumption is the Dino part, that it already has kind of a semantic structure built in on a coarse-grained level. What Stego does is add this added layer of where they literally, or the system literally goes pixel by pixel and assigns what is part of something in the sense that it's semantically related to it, so that it should be associated with the same label. And when they compare it to a variety of different models that do the same thing, of course, all of them have different levels of accuracy and so on. But on the whole, Stego is, dare I say, something like twice as good in terms of accuracy. Like the average would be 24, 25, 26%. Stego approaches 60. And again, this is without any human interpretation or human labeling at all. There's no ground truth in anything that Stego does. It's actually quite impressive. Now, having said that, the caveat and the kind of the little worrisome not in terms of the research that this represents, because I think it's a really, really important next step. We have a deluge of data, and anything that can help with that can only be good, with the following caveat, and the researchers themselves cover it. The first one and first most important thing is that the labels are arbitrary. The ontology is fixed. It's not like you're going to unleash all of these images and the system somehow is going to conjure up an ontological structure of a universe that it's trying to infer. That's not what's happening here. So this is just Andy Lachinsky speaking. If the issue is to use systems like this, and this is primarily how they're used, at least now, to kind of plug in the holes of what we don't know, so that if our data set is not as complete as we need it to be, well, systems like this can help complete it. That's one thing. But what I'm afraid of, I hope it's not going to happen, is that maybe startups or someone there's, oh, this is really neat. Let's start creating these enormous, gigantic data sets by doing this. You're free to do so, but you're also free to imagine all of the problems from a fundamental lack of any ontology that's being built along with the data set, what that might have for the data. If your ontology doesn't have room for a given label, that in fact may be either an important or even less important part, but might be important somewhere down, further down the pipeline. Well, if it's not in the ontology that this thing is using and leveraging, it's not going to show up by itself. And they also point out that even as it exists now, as powerful as it is, it's still confused by odd images. Like if you have a banana sitting on a phone receiver, it's going to have issues with that. So it's a mix of stuff. As a framework, it's exceedingly powerful and demonstrably better than any of the state of the art that we have.
It also makes me think of, a couple podcasts ago, we talked about a GAO report. Remember, it had that really scary graphic in it of like an army labeling thing where like the sky was one tiny box in the sky and there was like a big barrier in the background, but the barrier box is only on like one part of the fence. At least when you look at this, right, it gets things like this is the entire fence or this is the sky or the road, right? So it actually labels that entire surface or that entire thing.
Right.
But yeah, it still clearly has some other things to be thinking about here.
And let's conclude with a really, really neat application. In fact, we're going to call it the genuinely interesting application of the week. It's called Elicit, and you can go to it, elicit.org. And when you click here, it's GPT-3 based, and it's very sparse, very minimal, kind of like Google. And arguably for me, when you land on the page, I urge our listeners that do so, don't click away. It'll look like it's uninteresting. Trust me, okay? Because the first page that pops up is just ask a research question. Elicited will find answers from 205 million papers, and it literally looks like a Google search bar. It's interesting, and you can see what it does, but that's by far the least interesting part of what this is designed to do. What you really need to do is go to the top of the page where you have the line, and you'll see a list that pops up if you click there. It has like 50 or 60 different items where it's kind of pre-set for you to do a variety of things. Here's where the fascinating stuff happens. So what do I mean by variety of things? Brainstorm research questions, suggest research terms, evaluate the impact of a research title, clarify a concept. There's a whole litany of really neat stuff. And because it's GPT-3 based, 50, 60, 70% of it will just be funny and you'll move on to something else. Every once in a while, it's uncannily and genuinely useful. So as a quick example, if you go to the flashy headlines task, I put in the prompt line, yet another chip has been planted into a human brain. And the elicit very quickly comes up with a couple of flashy headlines. So if I'm an editor of a newspaper, I can make use of this. Here are some examples. Meet the nanobot brain hackers. Have chips been planted into your brains yet? The brain hack chip, one small implant, no big headaches. Anyway, you get the idea, but this is sincerely not meant to make fun of it. In fact, for brainstorming research questions, I asked one about AI and using to probe soldiers' consciousness. I won't take the time right now to read through that, but these are genuinely intriguing kind of responses, as one might expect from GPT-3. So as I say, I don't know if you've had a chance to use it, but to me, it's a genuinely interesting application that it could be a time sink if you start playing with it.
No, definitely check it out if you have a chance. I think it's also probably for a lot of us, or at least certainly me, one of our few ways to access GPT-3 level algorithm, because I still, I don't have access to the mainframe, so to speak. So this is a way that you can kind of play with it, obviously then with a particular research type of flavor and impact on it. But it still can be a lot of fun, like you said, just to see what it comes back with you on what you throw at it.
That'll do it.
All right, well, if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. That's cna.org/CAAI. But I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords. Thanks as always, Andy. I'll see you next time.
Sounds good.